Good morning. It is Tuesday, December 1st, and welcome back to The Advantage, where we will walk you through our data on political ads and spending. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Ben. How's everybody doing this week? Hope everybody had a nice Thanksgiving. So, Rachel, today we are going to talk about our cycle and review document that we're going to be putting out. Do you want to?
We are, and so before we dive into the meat of it, I do want to just reiterate, in case anybody missed it, that we have changed our name. So up until now, we were operating as Advertising Analytics. We are now AdImpact. We got some new swag to go with it. So this document will be released under that name. So if you see it floating around, it is definitely ours. And really what this document is it's just a review of the 2020 cycle, the major spending trends, the messaging that we saw coming out of each party, what was happening at the presidential level, in Senate races and House races. So we thought we would give you a sneak peek today and run through some of that. Ben, why don't you go ahead and kick off the total dollar amount that we closed the 2019-2020 cycle with?
Yeah, absolutely. So through 11/3, just want to put out a little caveat here that we put together this document before the runoffs. So none of the figures here are going to include the runoff spending, which obviously is going to drive these figures up even more. But for the 2019-2020 election cycle through 11/3, we saw $8.5 billion in political ad spending, which is a huge increase over anything we've ever seen before, about over 100% increase from 2017-2018, which was previously the biggest cycle we'd ever seen. And that's obviously remarkable in and of itself, but a lot of people are going to say, oh, it's just the presidential, like that's the only reason that it's so different. But that's really not the case at all for a bunch of different reasons. We saw, obviously the presidential was a huge category, but we saw twice as much money as we've ever seen in the Senate. We saw record-breaking spending in the House. We saw record-breaking down-ballot spending. And I think one thing that people forget about the 2017-2018 cycle is that the gubernatorial category was actually the largest category, and that was essentially non-existent this year. There are only a couple governor's races this year. So to see this amount of increase without a category that accounted for $1 billion in 2018 is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've spent a lot of time talking through those numbers and talking through the separate categories, and it never stops being an amazing amount of money. It is fun, I think, to look at what that money bought people. So in sum, that accounted for 9.3 million TV ads in more than 4,300 federal, state, and local races. So I think those numbers are so big they start to lose some of their meaning, but that just gives us an idea of the scale of what was happening politically in 2019, 2020. I also want to spend a little bit of time going through just some of the major spending trends that we saw. This cycle held true to form in that spending, aside from the Michael Bloomberg Democratic primary blip in early 2020, spending really concentrated heavily in September and October. We saw it just absolutely skyrocket. And what was so, excuse me, my headphones are falling out. Such is life in 2020. But in September and October, it skyrocketed to an extent that it never has in previous election cycles, which is really notable. And we have an interesting graphic that we can show you now, but that you can also find in this report with some more detailed information on how that spending shook out. But we also looked at the media type breakout, Ben, and if you wanted to talk a little bit about the conversation surrounding broadcast and digital, and then I think really briefly radio is an interesting piece to bring in here.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been a lot of talk, maybe not in the media world so much, but just broadly speaking, that people don't watch TV anymore, and that it's no longer a good way to reach voters. But that's really just not the case. Broadcast as an overall category grew a lot this year, though that's more just due to the overall pie being larger. But one of the things that we saw was there's this idea that digital is going to cut into the broadcast revenue, and that may be true at some point down the line. But right now we're seeing that broadcast still makes up a majority of political ad spending dollars. And digital, at least on Facebook and Google, who are making these numbers available, is about equivalent to cable at about 20% of the overall media type pie. But the digital factor is really interesting because it's not all persuasion advertising. It's not all 30-second spots, 15, 60-second spots that say, hey, vote for my candidate, and here's why. a lot of it is more what we call direct response, which is buy my merchandise and list building and fundraising. So really digital is almost more of a competitor to something like direct mail or something like that, where it's really a fundraising avenue. The majority of digital dollars are directly going towards fundraising. So digital really more than anything works as an amplifier for broadcast and cable and radio, where money spent on digital provides a return that then allows you to put money into certainly digital persuasion advertising, but also broadcast and cable and radio as well. So they really have kind of a mutually beneficial relationship where the larger digital spending really works to benefit other media types. And then I think we're actually going to see that continue. Certainly there's going to be more OTT and Hulu and Roku and things like that. But overall, digital works really well as a fundraising tool. And you hit on radio, which is something that a lot of people think has just totally died, but is really not the case at all. Radio is actually a really, really useful tool that we saw used in some really interesting ways this year to target groups in a very cost-effective way that might not be as efficient as on broadcast. One of the advantages with radio is that it's very kind of demographically focused. Broadcast TV is by its very nature broad, essentially, whereas radio, you have your country station and your news and your Spanish language pop and your Spanish language news, and you've got all these different things that really allow you to focus and pretty efficiently, pretty cheaply target really, really key demographics. And we saw that used in some really interesting ways, especially at the presidential level.
I think the radio piece is a really interesting one and something that we got a chance to cover a little bit more extensively this year in some of our communications and some of what we were looking at on our end. I want to briefly run through, as we're talking about not the cycle in general, but this document about what we've put together and what we're putting out to the public. We have collected so much data, and I was just curious if you could sort of give people some insight into how we do that, where this data comes from, why it's reliable.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that is really strong about the data operation that we have here that's powered by a bunch of really, really remarkably hardworking people behind the scenes is that it's all kind of interrelated. We have all these different ways to track the data that works together to provide a broad picture. So one of the main things we're utilizing here is our television ad tracking software, which in real time, within 2 hours of the ad's first airing, we're able to capture the first airing of that ad and then track subsequently every time that this ad airs. So this allows us to provide really, really detailed and really, really accurate, because it's the actual broadcast feeds that we're utilizing for the data, what the messaging is, and then who's seeing that and what the messaging is. So we can really break down and say, Democrats were really talking about healthcare and Republicans had a broader swath of messaging in the House. So it really provides for some interesting breakouts, and we can see what, when, where, which provides kind of a three-dimensional view of the messaging. And then the ad spending, which is a lot of the times provides these big interesting numbers, $8.5 billion. That comes from really a lot of different sources. We're talking to cable providers and broadcast stations and radio and Facebook and Google they're all making this data available in their own different ways. And we have a team that's going in, collecting it, synthesizing it, and all putting it into one database that makes it really easy for us to go in and see not only what the aggregate totals are, but what Kelly Loeffler did or what Joe Biden did or what Donald Trump did, and what media they're buying, what they're buying on broadcast, cable, radio, what stations they're buying, how much and when, and then we're able to compare to the broadcast messaging so we can see what they're buying ahead of time and then what the messaging they're using. They're using that money to actually show to voters, which provides a really kind of detailed way of looking at the data where it's not just one data point, but we have a whole bunch of different ways to look at the data that all works together to provide a really, really both granular but also accurate view of the political ad spending landscape.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to watch it from behind the scenes, but it definitely comes together and puts together this whole complete picture with a lot of context for people who consume our data. So if anybody has questions about that, you can actually reach out to Ben at the address listed below. You can always reach out to us at info@adimpact.com. We will have this report available on our website, and keep an eye out for our Twitter. You can follow us on LinkedIn too. Keep an eye out for what's coming next. We're tracking the Georgia Senate runoffs right now, so there is still a lot of spending activity that's happening. We'll be back next week with more information. Please forgive any technical difficulties today. It's one of the first times we've been virtual, so it goes. And have a great week.
Everybody stay safe.